Welcome to our Ochre Learning webinar on intellectual preparation, how to adapt curriculum resources to meet students at their point of need. Just a reminder that this webinar is going to be recorded and we have a really large number of participants today. So I won't be able to answer questions or respond in the chat for most of the presentation. Thank you so much for understanding. I might be able to address some questions at the end. So I'm on Wurundjeri land. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri land tonight. But it's also really important to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight. And I pay my respects, and Ochre pays their respects to elders past and present and any First Nations people here today. We are joined by people all over the country, and it's really excited to have you with us here tonight. Just for your information, the slides that I'm using, as well as the guide that I'll show you on the website, are copyright, but we can move on from there. And just a little bit about Ochre Learning. So Ochre Learning is the professional learning branch of Ochre Education, and it comes from a place with the intention of supporting school leaders and teachers on implementing high quality curriculum. So if you go onto Ochre Learning, you'll see that there's webinars and workshops to support you to design a knowledge-rich curriculum unit, to implement high quality curriculum resources, to support your implementation of curriculum resources, even to plan how you're going to use Ochre resources. And all the revenue that's raised from that goes back into Ochre Education, which is a not-for-profit. So it's there, and this is a part of it. So for tonight, I'm going to be talking through our guide to intellectual preparation, and I just want to show you where that's located so you can follow along with me. So here I am on the Ochre website, and if you just go to implementation support, and then from implementation support, you can click implementation, any subject, secondary or primary, and you will find an implementation guide, which includes how to implement the unit in intellectual preparation. And that's what I'm going to be speaking through today. So please go ahead to the Ochre website and then go to implementation support, click in, and from implementation support, then you can click on the implementation guide. And this has everything you might ever want to know about how to implement Ochre resources. And that's what I'll be speaking to. Of course, if tonight's webinar is not enough, you're also able to sign in for even more support to one of our Ochre Learning workshops. So there you would just click into Ochre Learning. And the particular Ochre Learning courses that are most relevant to what we're discussing, I think there are three. The first is curriculum implementation for leaders. So that is all about how to implement high quality curriculum in a school. It can be for curriculum leaders, assistant principals, and principals, and it will support you to understand and share the evidence for using high quality instructional resources. It will take you through how to plan an action, develop an action plan to deliver professional learning about how to introduce intellectual preparation and high quality curriculum resources. We go through how to re-engineer and restructure collaborative time and meeting time using a bank of high quality shared resources. So it's really valuable. You also get, so that's 3 workshops, and you also get a coaching session with me on any aspect of the implementation that you want to look at. If you are a classroom teacher or maybe a domain leader, you could also sign in for intellectual preparation for teachers, either the maths or the English. We go through some of the same intellectual preparation prompts that we'll go through tonight, but obviously with domain-specific pedagogy and troubleshooting for domain-specific aspects of teaching and how to implement the unit. So what we're going to cover tonight is the evidence for using high quality curriculum resources. We're going to outline the unit plan implementation processes. I'm going to introduce you to intellectual preparation, and we're actually going to engage with intellectual preparation ourselves. What I'm presenting today has not just come from international evidence, case studies, what's worked in schools around the world, but it's also what's worked for Ochre users, and it's also drawn from my own personal experience. So I am a assistant principal at a secondary school, a government secondary school in the very north of Melbourne, and I had to do a lot of this myself. So as a curriculum leader, we didn't have Ochre resources at the time. Unfortunately, they hadn't been developed yet. But faced with the challenge of implementing a shared bank of high quality resources, these are the pitfalls that we faced as a school, and it feels good to be able to share those with you, so you don't have to go through those as well. In the end, the challenge for us in this webinar is that we're actually aiming to shift our practice to adopting, adapting, and refining curriculum resources that someone else has made. And I'll explain that's actually much more of a challenge than it might sound at the outset. But before we do that, why? Why are we taking on this challenge? And I want to take you through two really important pieces of evidence that changed my mind about the value of pre-prepared resources and why it's so important to use them. So the first piece of evidence for adopting high quality curriculum resources is that they actually yield better outcomes for students. So I used to think that it was all about the teaching. It didn't really matter what the instructional resources were, what the textbook was, anything like that, so long as the teaching was good and that each teacher would be able to teach well despite or because of what the resources are. That's actually not the case. And I think the evidence is in that some curriculum resources yield better academic outcomes for students than others. The study that I think illustrates this the most was done quite recently by Grisma and colleagues. And this was a long-term evaluation of the use of a high quality curriculum. So that's the knowledge, core knowledge curriculum in charter schools compared to other charter schools that didn't use the core knowledge curriculum. So it was a lottery. The only difference between the different students and schools is that some had access to this high quality curriculum resource and other students did not. And the impact of that high quality curriculum resource was really marked. The biggest impact, as you can see here, was in reading. So that's almost half a standard deviation above other students who did not receive the high quality curriculum. And that equates to, you know, this is year 5, I think, after entering from their equivalent of prep. That's about 10% percentage points more. And that was something that compounded over time. I think something else that was really interesting from this study is that the improvement or the yield of the high quality curriculum was actually enough to close achievement gaps between high income and low income students as well. So not only are high quality curriculum resources impactful, they can also address equity issues in our system. And I've also noted here that they're a really good intervention to use in a school because implementing high quality curriculum resources is usually pretty low cost or cost neutral because they cost as much as bad curriculum resources, right? So yeah, it does matter what you are teaching and what your instructional resources are. The second piece of evidence, I think, made more instinctive sense to me, which is that implementing high quality instructional resources actually yields better teaching practice as well as better outcomes for students. So this comes from a project in the US where instead of writing or making curriculum, teachers were given an existing set of curriculum resources, and they spent their meeting time, coaching and professional development and collaborative time talking with each other about how they were going to teach the upcoming lessons. So what are we trying to get out of this lesson starter? How can we build on or expand on these explanations that have been provided for us? And then implement feedback from those lessons. And they found that through surveys and observations, the actual quality of teaching that was going on in those schools was much better compared to the control. And that to me makes sense. If you take away all the time and focus on just simply making curriculum resources and free that up to speak with and collaborate with colleagues on how you're using the existing curriculum resources, it's a much more productive way to spend that time. So how do we do it? Well, I felt really emboldened by that evidence. I got a USB, I got lots of high quality curriculum from other schools, and we rolled it out at my school as best we could. Unfortunately, though, we came across three big problems. So what can go wrong when you're using resources that someone else has made? The first thing we experienced was something our humanities leader, Meg Nicholas, called DJ press play. So this comes from, like, you go to a wedding, there's a DJ, the DJ set up with, lots of records, decks, wearing headphones. There's lots of switches that the DJ's pretending to push or dials they're pretending to turn, but really the DJ's just pressed play on Spotify. So DJ press play in lesson terms is basically when a teacher has taken a PowerPoint slide or curriculum resources or worksheet that they haven't made themselves, they haven't used before, and they just go into the class cold and they start teaching it. Now, I am guilty of this, so I feel comfortable saying DJ press play means that you're just not getting the best out of that curriculum resource. So my colleagues and I have had experiences where we've been going through some examples and then we're surprised by what's on the next slide. A student asks a question on one slide about what we mean by a certain phrase or term. We're not quite sure. We accidentally skip over a part of an activity that was really important just simply because we're not prepared, and we just, like I said, surprised by what's on the next slide. The next thing that can go wrong is something called lethal mutations. So the idea that you can change lots of things about a lesson or about resources, but there are some changes that really take away from the overall value or quality or impact of the instructional resources. So just like you can really change things up in a recipe and still get a fantastic result, if you use just regular flour instead of self-raising flour, that's a lethal mutation, right? You end up with something that you didn't want in the first place. And lethal mutations, in terms of delivering lessons, they can be really small. So I remember once in one of my early science classes, I had a fantastic explanation of solubility, and I had a little experiment for students to do. Unfortunately, the lethal mutation to that lesson was I handed out all of my practical materials to the students before I had given my explanation. So while I was giving just top-notch explanation of solubility, none of my students were listening. They were playing with eyedroppers and little pipettes and different chemicals and things like that. No one heard a word that I was saying. But lethal mutations can also be quite big. So using curriculum resources that are significantly below the level that the students are supposed to be at, or even moving much more slower and cutting out whole chunks of content at the end of a unit, or always removing the worded problems out of some maths questions, for example. So we had a lot of that going on. And then finally, we also had some lone rangers. So lone rangers, or people who go rogue, this was in the teaching team. So we had everyone agreeing that we were going to use a particular curriculum resource. But for whatever reason, there would be one teacher or a couple of teachers that just weren't able to implement the resource in the way that they wanted, and they would end up either significantly changing the resource to the point where it really wasn't recognizable anymore, or they just used something else that they got from the internet or something that they had used in a previous school. And you can often tell lone rangers when you're walking past someone's classroom. You think, wow, those slides look really different. I don't even know what that is. But also another telltale sign is when teachers are using different assessment tasks to the others in their team. These all have the impact of taking away from the benefits of using high quality shared curriculum resources. And I think actually it's because it's quite hard. Because when we're aiming to shift our practice to adopting, adapting, and refining curriculum resources that someone else has made, we can't keep doing what we've always been doing, and we can't just assume that everything's going to work as soon as we download the slides. And this has actually borne out in the research. So high quality curriculum has yielded weaker achievement gains in some settings because of issues with implementation. So one study in particular of the use of a really high quality textbook that had seen lots of gains in other settings, the researchers were predicting to see really big gains in student outcomes when implemented in this particular state in the US, and they just didn't happen. And what they found was going on was that teachers hadn't had much professional development to be able to implement the curriculum in the way that it was intended to. They also found that teachers were bringing in other resources. Some were differentiating down significantly to the point where students were missing out on critical vocabulary and concepts. And the results just showed that the textbook hadn't had much impact even when it changed, and even though it was expected to. And so that's in the Blazer study if you're interested in looking at that one. I think it's important, of course, it makes sense that if you're not implementing the curriculum in the way that it's intended, you're not going to get the benefits. But someone else, a researcher in this field, David Steiner, makes a really important note that I think we should all consider. So he says, why aren't there stronger positive outcomes when you use shared curriculum resources? It's because most teachers simply don't use the new material for most instructional purposes. They might pull a quiz or a homework assignment from the curriculum, but when it comes to daily instruction, they water it down. They mix it with stuff from the internet. They skim over other material by giving students few opportunities to grapple with the rigorous content. Telling teachers just to do it, just teach the darn curriculum, isn't working. While there is obviously some truth to these responses, I think they miss a key point. Teachers are often behaving rationally, and that's from David Steiner, a very prominent researcher in this field. And David Steiner is absolutely right. So when he's investigated why high quality curriculum resources haven't had the impact that we've wanted, it has been because of really understandable things. So, for example, in the US, it was the resources that the teachers were supposed to use not aligning with their assessments and state tests. And so teachers feeling really torn about which one they should implement and not knowing whether to chop or change. They also had the experience of teachers finding their students were significantly behind in their learning and not able to access some of the resources that they were supposed to use. And therefore, they just felt that they couldn't use the resources. And this is something that I had experienced myself at my own school. I was speaking with a humanities teacher about why she wasn't using the humanities textbook in the way that her colleagues were. And she quite rightly said that many of her students were quite low literacy, and there was just no way that they would be able to access the textbook on their own. Now, the solution to that was working with the teacher on previewing some of the text, checking in with students, asking structured questions, preloading knowledge, and the scaffolds there were actually able to allow the students to use the textbook. But the point is the same, that you can't just, there was no way that we could have just given the students that textbook and expected them to be able to answer those comprehension questions. So it makes sense. In fact, a lot of the issues with curriculum implementation and how to implement curriculum well happen before we get to the classroom. So this is something that we'll cover in the Intellectual Preparation for Leaders course. A lot of the barriers to implementing high quality curriculum happen before we get to the classroom. So, for example, if your school is an explicit instruction school and you're all for the I do, we do, you do in lessons, well, if you've got a curriculum resource that is all about inquiry and getting into the learning pit, you're not going to be able to implement it properly, right? Because the school would have one opinion on how you're meant to start a lesson, and the resource would have another opinion about how you're supposed to start the lesson. So a lot of the coherence and clarity that you need to be able to implement curriculum resources properly happens before you enter the classroom. And what happens in the classroom and what happens individually is intellectual preparation. So in our implementation guide on the Ochre website, you'll see that there are some initial steps that teams or individuals should take to implement the unit plan. And this is the first way to prevent some of those pitfalls which make curriculum implementation much less effective. And so the first thing is that you really have to implement the unit plan and be really purposeful and deliberate about that implementation. So the guide goes through how it's really important to determine assessment and understand what students and what and how students are going to be assessed. And that's not just necessarily the summative assessment at the end of the unit, but how are teachers going to be making a judgment about the student's level of achievement? Once you understand what the assessment is, that's going to be a really important lens for you to then decide, okay, what parts of the unit do we need to keep? What parts do we need to change? Is this everything that we need? Okay. After you've got that assessment, you then connect the lessons to the assessment. So you look over the unit plan of the resources that you've decided to adopt, and you make connections to how and where those lessons are building the student's skills and knowledge that lead up to that assessment. And as you're looking over, you might bring in your own understanding of, okay, well, this unit is assuming that students already know about fractions, but I happen to know from the previous year that they're going to need to review fractions before they can access this. And you can also discuss with colleagues what are the most important lessons in this unit to make sure that students are going to be able to do well in the assessment, and what's gaps or what's overlap. Then you take the lessons that are in the unit plan and you actually allocate them over the school's planner or a subject timeline. This is absolutely critical, but it's also something that we tend to skip over or forget. So you really need to note, okay, this unit plan has certain reliances. It's going to have certain events that are going to disrupt it. How are we going to get it done in time? It looks like these resources anticipate that there's going to be an hour-long lesson, but our lessons at our school are 50 minutes. What does that mean? So allocating and actually stepping out the lessons across a subject timeline or school planner and noting disruptions is really essential to being able to implement the unit properly. And then after that, some adjustment and adaptation of lessons needs to happen before you start the unit. So this is where you would proactively identify like particular lesson activities or resources that you might want to change or add to or remove. So that might be there's a particular activity from the old unit or that a teacher really loves. That's fine, great. Bring that activity and place it into the unit plan and plan around it. You might find that you need to change vocabulary, insert different textbook references. You might find that just because of the pace that students are learning at in your school, you might need to update or reduce or add to the instructional cycles that are taking place in that lesson. Your school might have a particular focus where you need to update the lesson resources to reflect that focus. So for example, if you're at a Berry Street Education School and your school insists it's really important to start your class with morning circle, well, at this point when you're planning the unit, you need to say, okay, for these lessons, we need to make sure there's space in here for morning circle. And of course, some adjustments might just be for a particular lesson, like you want to change one activity or you see a diagram in a lesson that you think could be changed or improved. So that's really important too. And then finally, after you've discussed all these adjustments and changes that you want to make, you actually have to assign the work and monitor that it's complete and discuss how the updates should be documented. So that's the work that should be done before you get to the classroom, before you are starting to prepare your lessons. And it can reduce a lot of the mixed messages, competing priorities, and cognitive dissonance that can sometimes happen when we are implementing curriculum resources that someone else has made. After after you've implemented the unit, it's now time for intellectual preparation. So intellectual preparation refers to any process of bringing together the teacher's knowledge of content with their knowledge of the students to prepare for a lesson. Now, here at Ochre, and obviously the purpose of this webinar is talking about how to implement curriculum resources you haven't made yourself. So for our purposes and for the purposes of the intellectual preparation guide, we're offering a slightly narrower and more refined definition. And that is that intellectual preparation is an individual teacher's process of planning and refining existing resources to ensure that students are able to think, learn, and engage with the key knowledge and skills within a lesson. So what does intellectual preparation look like? Across the world, it takes many different forms. So it's everything from Japanese lesson study to formal lesson plans and beyond. So this example that I've got here, this is just a teacher that has planned before they've gone into the lesson how they're going to explain a particular aspect of a worksheet. All right, so just handwritten notes. That's intellectual preparation. These are prompts that have been used in a charter school in the US about how to, what to be thinking about as you are planning lessons using prepared resources. So these are a series of prompts. This is a straight up lesson plan. So intellectual preparation can take the form of writing a formal lesson plan. And it can also take the form of adding notes, switching slides, and planning how you're going to implement slides. So these are slides that I've taken from one of Ochre's secondary maths lessons. And what someone might do here is they might add to the speaker notes, they might map out the worked example themselves, think about what their instructions are going to be to students, in between the worked example in the example problem pair and when the students have a go. They might hide some worked examples, switch them around, that kind of thing. That's all intellectual preparation. As I said before, the point is you're refining and planning existing resources. You're not making them yourself. And I think that's a really important thing to expand on. What is the difference between intellectual preparation versus lesson planning versus making resources? I think it's really important to discuss here because in Australia, I feel there is a pervasive and system-wide conflation of creating resources with lesson planning. And I think we hear it all the time. Teachers saying, oh, I just can't teach a lesson that I haven't made myself. Or teachers reflecting that when they have made their own curriculum resources, the lesson tends to go better. Um, that's not because the resources that the teachers have made are inherently high quality or inherently fantastic. It's actually because of the preparation or intellectual preparation that's gone on into making that resource. So why do we think that making resources is the same as lesson planning? Well, I think at a government level, compared to other countries, our curriculum is very open and does expect teachers to interpret and put together curriculum pieces themselves. But I think it also comes from university. So when I did my teacher training, a lot of my assessment on whether I was a good teacher was actually assessment requiring me to make resources from scratch. And I think that filters into schools as well. So schools need a guaranteed and viable curriculum, and it's usually the work of teachers to have that, but schools might also look for teachers who make really great resources as examples of curriculum leaders. And I think in the end, it's also because of us teachers. So because of the system, I feel like I used to feel that if I hadn't made a lesson myself, it just wouldn't be as good. And I often felt quite guilty when I had, done shortcuts or things like that, where I hadn't made the resource myself. So teachers often feel like they are not doing the right thing or somehow skipping or cheating if they haven't made the resources themselves. When actually that's completely different to planning a really great lesson. They're not the same. So if we think about it this way, so you've got this Venn diagram, you've got all the work that's required to make curriculum resources. So, that's preparation that's required to make a set of lesson slides that isn't like intellectual preparation. So that might be making the slides, changing the font, looking for images, trying to get the worksheet to match the questions on the slide. And intellectual preparation is everything that's required to make, to prepare a lesson that isn't required to make a set of slides or worksheets. So that would be developing a questioning sequence, anticipating misconceptions. Well, obviously, in the real world, when you're making curriculum resources, in the process of making those resources, you are engaging somewhat in intellectual preparation. So as you are making your slides or making your worksheet, you are thinking about what are the students going to be doing at that time. You are thinking about potential question sequences that you can ask or what a good example would be. So resource creation feels useful to us because it's usually when we make resources, that's our way of engaging in intellectual preparation. But I'm here to tell you that you can engage in intellectual preparation without having to make the resources yourself. So what does that intellectual preparation look like? In your implementation guide, you'll see that I have a series, we've got a series of prompts here on what you can think about to intellectually prepare for a lesson using resources that you didn't make yourself. Now, these have come from a range of different places. They've come from other high quality intellectual preparation protocols in charter schools internationally. They're based on cognitive science and science of learning and also Rosenshine's principles of instruction. At the heart of these questions is every single consideration you could possibly make to improve how you are going to teach the existing resource. And it also will help you decide as you're preparing to teach, well, what part of that resource might I need to tweak or change in order to get the best outcome? Now, Ochre resources have taken a lot of these considerations into account already. So the intention isn't that you have to go through every single prompt. Different resources might require different areas of focus. Similarly, different teachers might need to spend more time on particular actions or considerations than others. But this is the general idea about some of the considerations you can put into preparation of existing curriculum resources. So the first prompt is all about, okay, what's the core skill or concept that students need to get out of this lesson? So things that you should be doing before you teach the lesson, where does it show up in the unit plan? What happened in the previous lesson? What's the assumed knowledge? What really requires review? Another category of prompt is how and when will students demonstrate their thinking, learning, and progress? This is a really important one for me personally. When I am teaching something that I haven't taught before or that I'm not super confident in. And that is just simply to think about what is the task that students are expected to do and making sure I know what they are, what the quality of the answer is that I'm expecting. And also to make sure I've got opportunities along the way to check for understanding. And I'm thinking about how all the students are able to participate. It's also where I'm thinking as a teacher, what is going to be on-task behavior at any point in the lesson? So while I'm teaching, what should the students be doing? Should they be taking notes? Should they be sitting silently and watching me? Should they be working quietly in their books? Should they be working in groups? What are the students doing while I am teaching? Because that then allows me to articulate that while I am teaching. So as I introduce the lesson, I might say, okay, I've got notes up on the board. I don't want you to write them at the moment, though. I just want you to listen to me. And it helps clarify that. Third, what are potential misconceptions and how can the lesson preempt or address them? So this might involve reading the teacher guidance notes. It might require you to look through parts of the lesson, the slides or the worksheet or the textbook and think, okay, how is the information sequenced? Does it make sense? Where are the students that are going from here to here to here? Okay. And you might notice that you might need to select or prepare some examples or models to aid your explanation. You might even want to keep some examples or worked examples in your back pocket. And so hide those slides, knowing that you can come back to them if the lesson doesn't go the way that you hope. It's also a time to think about how you're going to phrase questions and determine the format of questioning. So the quality of questions that you ask in class are absolutely vital to having a really great lesson. I mean, it's not something that teachers are usually able to come up with fantastically on the fly. So even if you've got fantastic lesson resources, simply thinking about how you're going to phrase questions and whether that's going to be something that you're asking the entire class, whether you're going to be calling for a particular volunteer or cold calling will make all the difference. And then thinking about additional supports or what else students might need to be able to meet the learning goal. So one way of thinking about this is if you've got a really high quality resource, lesson slides, worksheet, then that should have embedded within it lots of additional supports for specific learners in your class. So worked examples that you might find in slides with adequate planning and consideration are also really fantastic ways to support learners in your class that might have additional learning needs or where you have to use additional strategies for an IEP. So for example, if you've got some worked examples in there, you might need to read them aloud, step them through in a more chunked fashion. You might need to print that worked example and have it next to the student so they're working there. So often the supports are already within the resource. But it might also require you to think about what you're going to ask the integration aid to do. Think about, well, if students are going to be focused on this, how can I lower the cognitive load of this part of the lesson so that they're really going to be focused on what I want them to? It's also just where you think, okay, what do I actually need for this lesson? Do I know where my mini whiteboards are? And also consider student groups and pairings and roles. Then finally, and this one is really important um, for the teachers at my school, how can I build and maintain student engagement and lesson momentum? So that's where you would plan for a strong start that gets all students ready to learn. So for the teachers at my school, what is a lesson starter that literally every single student in the class is going to be able to feel confident starting with minimal instruction from the teacher? And if that doesn't match the do now that's already in our lesson slides, individual teachers will change it, right? Because a strong start to the lesson is really important. And also planning for that strong and well communicated finish. So when are you going to do time checks during independent practice? 5 minutes of the lesson remaining. What do you expect to see before the end of the lesson? What do students need to show you? But also identifying opportunities to include activities or examples that students enjoy or that they do well at or that you think will enhance their participation or understanding of the content. So if you see an example in there that is fine, but you know there's 2 students in the class that would absolutely focus and try their heart out if you changed the example to something about basketball, change the example to basketball. And make sure you're including and reviewing classroom routines and instructions to manage lesson transitions and student behavior. So often when I'm intellectually preparing my lessons, I will be thinking about, okay, if I am about to, say, use mini whiteboards, do I need to teach or practice or rehearse that routine for showing mini whiteboards before I actually go into that activity and making sure I plan that in? So I'm just going to give you a moment here for reflection. And I want you to think about some lessons. So using your intellectual preparation guide, I want you to think about a lesson or a series of lessons that you taught recently. And I want you to just think, what are some of the intellectual preparations or actions for that lesson that usually take place when you're making resources? So what are the aspects of intellectual preparation that you tend to do when you are making resources? And I wonder, as I went through the different intellectual preparation prompts from the Ochre guide, are there any really important intellectual preparation actions or considerations that you're just not doing or that you don't do enough of when you're making those resources? So I'm just going to pause for a moment and allow you to think about that. It'll only be a moment. Okay. Um, I hope what you found is that yes, you can engage in a lot of intellectual preparation while you're making resources. That's not necessarily the most efficient. And also, there are some considerations that fall into the category of intellectual preparation that are simply very hard to do or impossible to do just by making resources. You do need to turn your mind to them separately. Um, Now we've come to the part of the evening where I just want to raise that the guide really covers a lot of frequently asked questions that people have about intellectual preparation, and they're elaborated on quite significantly there. So some of the questions that come up are, why do I need to intellectually prepare if the lesson plans and resources already exist? Hopefully, if you've been a part of this webinar so far, you've seen that, DJ Press Play is not going to get you everything that you need. And it really is important to turn your mind to what's going to happen in the lesson. And so many aspects of our lesson are too important and too complex to be able to come up with them on the fly in a really complex classroom setting. How long should intellectual preparation take? And do I need to follow every prompt? Well, how long is a piece of string? No. Intellectual preparation, the duration takes a different amount of time depending on the teacher. Do you need to follow every prompt? No. So you'll find that a lot of high quality instructional resources have done a lot of that thinking for you. So maybe they've already made the exemplars or the models. Maybe they've already given you really high quality questions to ask. So you don't need to, follow every single prompt. But as you practice and use intellectual preparation and go through these prompts yourselves, when you're planning your lessons, you might find that there are some prompts that are really useful to you and some prompts that aren't as useful. So you'll get very efficient as you go through, knowing, okay, look, I'm pretty right, but I always have to make sure I'm thinking about how I define on and off task behavior. And I need to make sure I have a really strong start, and I want to make, something like that. How long does it take? If you are a new teacher or teaching out of field and you need more time to practice the core task, to think about how you're going to make those explanations because you're just not as familiar with the content, then of course intellectual preparation is going to take a little bit longer than someone who's been teaching, that same series of lessons for years, right? So it doesn't take a set amount of time, but I would say at our school, teachers are intellectually preparing quite efficiently. So it takes less than 30 minutes, even with a resource that is very unfamiliar to them. And you get more efficient over time as you practice. How do I document or share my intellectual preparation with colleagues? Well, like I said, you might be annotating notes on a printed worksheet. You might be updating or adding notes to slides. It really depends on what is most useful to you. In terms of sharing with colleagues, I think this leads into the next question as well. Like, what's the line between good unit planning or resources and my own intellectual preparation? So something that we discovered at our school is if the team finds themselves continuously needing to make significant changes to a unit resource, well, that might be something that you document in the column of the unit plan, that you discuss at a curriculum planning meeting, saying, okay, did everyone else find that they've ended up having to change all of these example problem pairs for this reason? And then your colleagues might say, yep, I've noticed that too. And then that can become something that is a wholesale change to the unit resource for teaching next year or teaching in upcoming units. So if you find yourself having to do a lot of intellectual preparation on a particular resource, that might be because aspects of the unit implementation need to be improved. Which parts of Ochre lessons are okay to change and which are not? Please take a look at the guide. You'll see that even when you look through Ochre lesson slides, you'll see that there are particular worked examples. You've got many worked examples. You might only need a couple of those worked examples or a couple of those instructional cycles for your students to get that across. So you might hide the rest of the slides. You'll also notice those difficulty gauges for students. So you might say, okay, I actually need lots more of those challenge questions. That's all great and fine. What I would say though is the Ochre lessons are based on, I think, really strong evidence based instruction and explicit instruction. And so parts of the lessons are really intentionally designed to have that impact. And so you can take away from the quality or have lethal mutations when you, I think, diverge from that high quality instruction. How can I differentiate for students with additional learning needs and IEPs? Again, please take a look at the guide. It goes through how we really should use these curriculum resources that we have. We should think of them as really high quality tier 1 instruction that might already have a lot of scaffolds and supports embedded within them. And then instead of changing, like wholesale changing a resource or thinking that you need to put in an entirely different mini lesson or an entirely different worksheet for a student who has an IEP, I really encourage you to look at multi-tiered systems of support and think about how we might adapt our instruction or be responsive to the student in that moment, rather than feel the guilt and the burden of having to change and make new instructional resources to anticipate every single learner's need. And often the best way to meet the needs of our learners is to think about what's in there already and then add to that resource rather than make something completely different. Is it okay to remove or reduce challenging content? The resources should be teaching students at level. So if students are in year 7, they should be doing level 7 English. It is students' curriculum entitlement to be able to access that curriculum. And I would say that when we reduce or remove challenging content, we are probably taking away the opportunity for that student to accelerate their learning. There are ways to scaffold and support students to access the at-level curriculum. And in my experience, teachers who have felt really nervous or uncomfortable about, teaching level 5 to year 5 students, when they try it and plan with additional scaffolds and supports, it actually ends up going pretty well. Is it okay to change the structure of Ochre lessons? I think explicit instruction is pretty good and you should stick with it, but please read the guide. So let's look at the case for intellectual preparation. In the end, high quality curriculum resources are probably better than what you can make on your own. The evidence tells us that high quality curriculum resources can have a really measurable impact on student outcomes. So if you find yourself diverging heavily from a textbook or an agreed resource, I think it's important to ask why. So as I said before, if you and your team are continuously changing an aspect of a resource, that might be an issue with unit implementation, but it also might be a lethal mutation. So have a think about why is it so hard to teach to this resource, and evaluate that. Is it because you don't have the scaffolds and supports for students to access at level curriculum? Is it because your assessment task that your school insists on you doing just isn't matching with the resource that you are expected to teach? And how can you resolve that? And in effective teaching, so intellectual preparation tasks have a greater impact on student learning than making tasks, which of course is maybe obvious that it is more impactful to plan a line of questioning than to, have the exact right font on your slide or to pick the right image. But I think it's important to know that making tasks aren't necessary. Teaching is too intense and too immediate to rely on instinct and real-time problem solving for critical intellectual preparation tasks, such as developing a questioning sequence. So we really do need to prepare before we go into our lessons using shared curriculum resources. And of course, time. Look, it's probably not true that intellectual preparation takes less time than DJ press play, right? Intellectual preparation, by definition, is going to take more time than 0 seconds, which is what some of the teachers, and admittedly me at our school, were doing. However, intellectual preparation does save time if you are used to lesson planning through creating resources yourself or through randomly tinkering back and forth with slides. Having an actual protocol that you go through does save time. It does save you time if the way that you review resources and unit plans often lacks direction or occurs intermittently or only happens when you have a spare moment in your lunch break. So if you have a process, again, it should be more effective and efficient. And it will save you time if, the way that you've taught a set of lessons has actually created issues that you then need to address later. So even though DJ Press Play might feel like it's saving you time at the start, if you think about the effort required to reteach a whole set of content to your students, or how hard it is to make do when you've forgotten a resource to bring it to class, or the behavioral follow-up or the catch-up lessons that can happen when we're not prepared, then I would say, I would say that it is definitely going to save you time to intellectually prepare. I'm just going to leave you with one example in action. So Anna's a Year 6 teacher preparing for a lesson on creative writing. She reviews an Ochre lesson on writing the complication and notes that the lesson assumes students have completed a writing plan from the previous lesson. Okay, so this is the vocabulary. But 4 students were absent that day and they missed instruction explaining what the complication is. They missed out on the vocabulary used to write the complication, and they missed out on the time to develop their own writing plan. At the end of the lesson, Anna also found that 2 students did not include any adjectives when writing their plan, even after they were prompted to. Okay, so intellectual preparation. She decides that she can support these students to fill in their plan, review adjectives, and catch up during individual writing time, so long as they know what the complication is. So she modifies the beginning of the lesson to restate the definition of a complication. She reviews her examples and checks for understanding. And to do this, she pastes in several slides from a previous lesson and changes 2 of the checks for understanding to a passage about the Eureka stockade, which was from a previous unit. She also inserts a group slide to be shown before the class moves on to independent writing. And that slide serves as a reminder for her to ask the 6 students, so those who are away and those who didn't use adjectives, to work with her at the front of the room, so she can guide them to fill out the template while the other students are doing their independent writing. So I leave you with these questions. I want you to consider your current approach. How is the implementation of your instructional materials going? What learning might be required to support your teachers to best use high quality instructional materials? And what elements of your school's approach might need to change? These changes and this learning can be aided by Ochre learning courses. Again, we've got the workshop for leaders and also for maths and English teachers, if that is something that you would like to pursue. But thank you so much for your time. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to all of these places, and hopefully I see you in one of the intellectual preparation workshops soon. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to hang back and just take a look at the chat.